Hello, my name is Jennifer Flake, and I'm going to be talking about get out of here, taking virtual programming on the road. I am the museum education coordinator at Discovery Gateway Children's Museum. So let's get started. Okay. Just as a brief introduction, I started working at the museum in August of 2019. Before that, I've worked mostly in libraries and an art museum. And right now, I manage usually a 3 to 4 person team within the museum education program. And the museum education program part that I handle is all the programming that happens within the museum itself. So we have a very broad education program at my museum, and there are lots of other parts of it where people, visit schools and manage field trips. And I don't do any of that, but I do the day-to-day stuff that happens in the museum, and then also some of the educational programming that happens at the museum. So when I started my job last year, my professional goals were that we would recognize diversity within the community via our events, which we were already doing, but I wanted to make sure that we continued to do that and continue to add events to the calendar. And also that we would increase the level of art education that we were offering, because I felt very lucky that I had this really positive experience at an art museum. And so I just wanted to bring some of the really great stuff that we were doing there to the Children's Museum that I was working at. As far as the museum education department goes, we provide STEAM programming within the museum. And the education department consists of science and art educators. Since this is an art education conference, I'm going to kind of focus on that. So the educator focuses on art technique and also on art history. There's usually a daily art activity for children that visit the museum. And within that daily activity, we try to talk a lot about the different cultures that artists come from or that cool art techniques come from. So, cultural programming is very much prioritized also within our STEAM programming. Just to tell you a little bit more about my museum, Discovery Gateway Children's Museum is located in Salt Lake City, Utah. The education department serves children ages 1 to 10. And through our outreach program, our science educators visit schools throughout the state for kindergarten and also for 5th grade. So there's kids very far away from Salt Lake because Utah is a pretty vast state. So there can be kids that live, 7 or more hours away from our museum that maybe don't come to the museum very often, but have some positive experiences because they have had outreach educators visit and teach them a little bit about science. We also serve children via our partnerships with Head Start and other organizations that serve pre-K children. So we have a very early childhood focus within the education department at the museum. Another part of my job that I really enjoy is that I get to work with a lot of museum partners. So this can come in the form of people that offer sponsorships and help us do the events, whether that's through donations of money or time. And also, I get to work with a lot of cultural partners. And something that we think is really important at the museum and that I find is really useful is to have a cultural partner for a lot of those cultural events that can give us advice and help us understand the best way to host, whether we're talking about a holiday or some other cultural event, help us make sure that we're doing super fun activities that are also accurate to that culture. And it's also a good way to help find people that can provide really cool performances so children can really get that firsthand sense of maybe what that holiday is like in that culture. And a big part of having cultural partners is that we'll do a lot of reciprocal events and we'll do other things to try and build those relationships. So I was thinking that a really good example to kind of explain this would be last year we had a Dia de los Muertos event within the museum. And the Mexican consul who was stationed within Salt Lake came and opened the event for us and also helped us open up an art exhibit that we had on a lower level that related to Dia de los Muertos. And so in return, we actually went to the event that the consulate threw, and we were able to provide an activity and all the supplies for the activity for the children that were at that event. So we are very excited to have partners, and we're excited to, build these good relationships by working with our partners as well. So one of the events that kind of highlights the importance of these relationships is called Children's Fest. Children's Fest has been happening for a really long time in our museum. It's kind of a tradition. So it's a free museum day. We typically get 3,000 to 5,000 patrons that attend. And just to give you kind of an idea, a typical museum day is about 1,000 people. So it's quite a lot. And then we will collaborate with 10 artists and cultural institutions to do different performances, like dance or music or other things like that. And then we'll also offer other organizations tables so that they can tell people about what they do. The museum will provide the space, and we also provide art activities throughout the museum that are focused on different cultures, and we provide all the supplies for that. We typically hold this event in the middle of the summer, and it's something that everyone looks forward to. It's just super fun. So we had planned to do this event in June of 2020, but March of 2020 happened. And like many other people, our plans were kind of put on hold, right? As we tried to handle the new pandemic and also closing the museum for an extended amount of time. So one of the ways that we handled this museum closure was we started doing something called the STEAM Learning Lab, which is 3 times a week. We offer online instructions with images and also maybe a video tutorial to help people understand how to do the activity. Our goal was to create activities that kids could do with their families at home. We wanted to make sure that we featured accessible supplies, stuff that was easy to find and not super expensive. And we also wanted to help, board families in this difficult time. One of the other goals was we really want to make sure that we kept this conversation open with our patrons while we were closed. We wanted to keep checking in on them, virtually. And finally, we wanted to meet any grant or funding obligations and also just goals that we had set for ourselves as a department. But so we were doing STEAM Learning Lab and it was working great. But as we got closer and closer to June, we realized that it was going to be very difficult to hold our Children's Fest like we had originally planned. And we were very sad about it. But by, late July, we realized that we probably needed to try and think of some sort of virtual substitute for this thing that we had been planning for a long time. So at first, it was kind of difficult because a lot of the conversation that we had always had around Children's Fest before had really focused on the number of people that were in the museum. So partners that were in the museum, guests that had come to the museum. It was very focused on attendance, which is difficult when you're doing virtual programming. Obviously, you can still measure attendance as views, as comments, things like that. But we realized that we needed to have some other objectives too to kind of guide how we were going to create some sort of new project that was going to fill this void. So first of all, we realized that there were some things that we always tried to do with Children's Fest. So we always wanted to support education about local diversity. We would try to hire local groups to showcase skills that they had, right? So we definitely wanted to keep doing that. We always try to reach kids throughout the state. Obviously, it's a free day and we get people, even from Wyoming next door, we'll get people from other states to come to these events. But that's always been a thing, is we want to invite a lot of kids throughout the state to come to these free days. But definitely there were always kids in the past that lived very far away that maybe weren't going to be able to make it to the free days. So we realized that this could also offer us an opportunity to reach out to kids that maybe we haven't been able to include in our Children's Fest programming before. So we were kind of excited about that. We wanted to make sure that things were financially accessible. So we knew that we definitely wanted to do some activities, but we wanted to make sure that the materials that we were telling people they could use in these activities was something that was not expensive or difficult to find. We also want to strengthen and increase partnerships because, in the past, we've always used this as a chance to connect with partners we've worked in the past and also invite new partners to come. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that we had really good attendance and, a similar amount of people viewing the materials as we did the, on a physical event day. So we had set the bar at about 3,000, which, as I showed in a previous slide, was kind of the low amount for having people attend the actual physical and the museum event. So we decided we wanted to have a similar number of people attend our virtual event. Okay, and also finally, we wanted to boost late summer STEAM lab participation. So we had a lot of participation, especially, in April and May. And then just as people get busy and it's the end of the summer and people are traveling a lot with their family, we felt like maybe people wouldn't want to participate as much in the STEAM Learning Lab. So we want to make sure that we picked an activity that would really meet people where they're at and encourage participation. Okay, so what we came up with is called Children's Bus to Go. It is a 10-stop road trip featuring cultural landmarks throughout the vast state. There are 2 virtual events, 10 art projects, and 10 recipes included because people just love recipes during the pandemic, and that's awesome. So we were excited to find some fun recipes too to go with our art projects. So in order to meet those objectives we talked about first, here's kind of how we structured it. So our first objective is that we wanted to support education about local diversity. So we decided that we would highlight diverse historical sites throughout the state to demonstrate how many different cultures had made contributions. We also used the local state history education standards to kind of figure out how to format our discussion of history with people. So we want to make sure that we were meeting state education standards for teaching young children about Utah state history. But then we also want to make sure that we weren't covering an event that maybe children had already talked about many, many times in school. So we tried to find spots where maybe there wasn't as much discussion within formal education and try and really highlight those sites. We also wanted to help kids experience cultures through food and being at a physical site rather than like a long history lesson, right? So we did do kind of short, very factual write-ups for each of the sites explaining what they were, why they were significant, and then what they're also used for right now. But we definitely wanted kids to really get that sense of history by just being somewhere, right? Or tasting some food, right? And so even though, because we planned this event kind of faster than we would normally plan another event, we couldn't get as many partners lined up. We thought that maybe by relying not so much on narrative, but mostly on the experience would make it good and feel like we had partnered with the cultures appropriately. So our second objective is that we wanted to reach kids throughout the state. So like I talked about before, we decided that digital programming was a great way to do this. And obviously, like, caveat, like, I understand that digital programming is also difficult, right? The digital divide is very real. And so we did try and approach that later on. But we definitely acknowledge that, but we realized that the most amount of children that we could reach would probably be through a digital medium. So that's what we decided to do for this particular event. We realized that we could have sites all over the state. So the road trip that we made, you could take it and do one continuous loop, which would be awesome. Or there's sites all over the state, and our goal was that each child would be within 2 hours of one of the sites. And so then that would give as many children as possible a chance to go and visit these different sites in a way that was easy for them. And finally, our goal was to demonstrate that multicultural history is happening everywhere. So it was something that all children could be really excited about. Okay, objective 3 was to make programming financially accessible. So We decided to do art projects that required easy to get materials like paint, glue, and paper rather than harder to find materials like brayers. Like I love to do really intense, cool printmaking projects with kids when they come visit, but the museum has a lot of artistic resources that maybe it can be really difficult for people to find. And so we didn't want anyone to feel like they couldn't participate because it was difficult to find or, buy the materials. So we decided to keep it really simple. Some of our projects required recyclables. Um, a bunch of our projects, so one of our projects only required a single piece of paper, and another one of our recipes only required a single ingredient because we definitely want it to feel like anybody could participate in the event. We also offered some art materials that we would give away for anybody who sent us a picture. So I think that this was a really good lesson for us to think about, was that ideally we'd be able to give out, tons of art materials to people all over the state, and that would be awesome. But with the short amount of notice that we had and the difficulties of the pandemic, that was going to be really hard. But we realized that we could offer a few sets of art materials for people that reached out to us. And so I think that's really important, that even if you maybe can only offer a few materials, or even if something's less than perfect, it's good to try and make that effort anyway. And finally, we offered a printable brochure. So people could definitely access our brochure online, and it was all easy to scroll through online, but we also made sure that it was really easy to print. And we encouraged everybody to print it and share it or send it through emails. So we made sure that it was easy for people to share if that's what they wanted to do. Okay, objective 4 was to strengthen and increase partnerships. So in the past, when we've done Children's Fest, we've had some partners that always come, right? And it's kind of almost like a tradition that they will come and do a certain activity. So we definitely want to make sure that we had something similar with this year's event. So we picked our partner, the Confucius Institute, to come and offer a class via Facebook Live on how to do paper cutting, which is something that they've done every year since the festival started. So it was great to have that sense of continuity, and it was great for us as an organization to be able to reach out to a partner and fulfill that obligation that we've always had with each other. So I think that was awesome. But we also want to make new partners with this event. And so we were able to reach out to a local archaeologist who talked to us about food fossils, which was also awesome. So I think maintaining the sense of partnerships being key to this event was really good for people, for our patrons to see, but also it was good for us inside as an organization to feel like we were still meeting that goal. Our objective 5 was attendance and conquering the summer slump. So our goal was to get over 3,000 people, which was the low end of people that would come to the museum's physical space. And also we thought we would offer a road trip, because we know that at this time of year, people don't want to be indoors. They want to be outside, they want to be exploring. And so by offering a road trip that we've already kind of planned out for families, we felt like that was a good way to reach out and meet people for activities they were already interested in. We also offered multiple activities for each of the locations. So for each location, we would have a physical spot you could go visit, a recipe, and then an art activity that represented the culture that we were talking about. And so by having all these different activities, then families could do whatever combination of activities worked well for them. So we thought that was very successful. Okay, so speaking of success, let's go ahead and talk about the results. Overall, we think this activity worked really well. We had 9,790 participants, and that again is based on social media participation. We also got one new partner, which was great. And we got a lot of pleased comments from museum patrons on social messaging. So just like if we'd held the event within the museum's physical space, we would have talked about, different patrons said things at the front desk or gave us this feedback. And that would have been a way that we have judged if the event was successful or not. By getting comments on social media, we were able to do a similar thing. Here's some things though that I might fix now that I've done the activity. So I would have liked to have more time to plan. Obviously, there's a lot of things right now where it's hard to plan for things. And so I feel like it's pretty understandable that this year we maybe didn't have the timeline that we would do in the future. But if I had more time to plan, I would have loved to get more partners for locations and co-writers. I feel like it was great that we offered these factual explanations for all our locations. And I feel like that was the right choice. But I also think if we could have found people that had some sort of connection to the places that we had featured, then had them write a little bit about their experiences there, it could have been more meaningful for our patrons. I also think it would be great to provide more art materials, or work with schools or get a grant or somehow be able to provide some of the supplies so that if kids are really interested, it's easy for them to do this activity. And then finally, I have some suggestions for people that want to do a similar activity on their own. First of all, I think that it's really hard to highlight all the cultures that you want to. For me, this was something that was difficult, was trying to decide which 10 cultures I wanted to highlight throughout the state. But I think something that could be really helpful for this is that if you think about everything holistically, so like I always try to plan out my calendar of events like a year in advance, with the understanding that maybe things will change, but this roughly is what I want to do. You can kind of see where you're going to highlight other cultures or other individuals or whatever you're trying to plan in other places on the calendar, and then that can help you decide what is most important that I highlight in this event, like what holes do we have in our calendar. um I also think it's great to find partners. For most of my events that I've done, especially in quarantine, we have had really good partners that help us and give us a lot of guidance. And I feel like that's very valuable. And it also can help you create activities that are so interesting and so much more um, like unique than if you are just the one that plans everything. Um, and I know that when I'm trying to find partners, it's great to think about ways that you can reciprocate too. So I think when we find partners, we try to think about ways that we can reciprocate, whether that's promoting an activity or a cause or their organization on our social media, or if it's going to an event or sharing some materials with them. So I think that's really important is find partners and then try to think of ways that you can be a good partner too and help them on their journey. I think it's really important to understand your goals. At different institutions that I've worked at, they may seem similar on the outside, but every institution can have really different goals. So it's good to kind of sit down and write out the goals for your institution. And along with that, I think it's great to communicate with people outside your department so that they will come along for the journey of the activity that you're planning. So if you talk to people outside of your department, like it's really good to have like a little elevator pitch. And this also is really good for partners that kind of briefly explains this is what we're going to do and this is why. I also think a big part of communicating with people outside your department is making sure that you have a list of people that you update every time you change even small details for these events. The bigger the event, the more people are going to want to know, even if you make small changes, and it can be hard to remember. So for myself, it's good to have a list or an email chain where you're just letting people know, hey, we changed this for this reason. Do you have any feedback? Um, but yeah, I think that having those relationships also can help you make sure that people like your patrons are going to understand what your goal is. In planning all these virtual programs, I think it's great to ask yourself, how will this aid next year's, hopefully in-person event, right? So I'm hoping that next year Children's Fest is in person and it's, full of people and it's a really happy, joyous thing that we get to do inside the museum. But something that we probably would do that we haven't ever done before is we would still have some sort of online component because it was so successful with those long distance patrons who maybe can't come into the museum all the time. And also, as a part of that, we would try to think of a way to like overcome any digital divide issues. So, like we've talked about, maybe we could print out materials and send them to these locations that are far away from the materials from the museum and have, a library or community center or something distribute them. Like there's probably some simple things that we could do to try and make sure that we're meeting as many patrons as possible where they're at. I also think that it's good to ask yourself, does this show the organization's values? And so also that can be great way to involve partners that maybe aren't directly involved with planning the event is to ask them, well, what do you think about this event? What do you think, what does it look like we're trying to do? Right. And get some really good, honest feedback from them because that can make them feel valued. And it can also help you understand if your message is getting across or if there's maybe a better way to approach it. And finally, I think it's really important to just remember that all digital programming is keeping a conversation alive with guests. So sometimes digital programming, it's not going to be perfect, but you just have to remember that it is one part of this conversation that you're having with your guests while maybe, institutions are doing a lot more online programming right now. So with that in mind, thank you all so much for doing this presentation with me. If you have any questions, let me go ahead and share my information. I am at, my organization is at discoverygateway.org, and you can find all of the resources that I've talked about today at that location. And then also my email is jflake@discoverygateway.org, and I would love to hear from you. So thank you and have a great day.